It took me 135 hours to platinum Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. Warning: the footage shown in this video is sourced from several playthroughs. Weaponry and armor sets regularly seen on screen are acquired with great experience in the game. If you have not played Dark Souls 2, please understand that the majority of these items are not available until later in the game and or in the DLC.
Damn, boy, he's thick! Boy, that's a thick-ass boy!
When I first started playing the trilogy, I began with Dark Souls 1 Remastered after finishing my platinum of Bloodborne, and I was only somewhat able to understand the love for Dark Souls. It felt as though the challenges in front of me were fair and unfair at the same time. You learn with every death and eventually overcome each challenge. Maybe Dark Souls 1 was just a little too slow-paced for my psychology. I moved on to play Dark Souls 3, which felt much better. It was far faster and felt similar to Bloodborne. I thought it was great, but I didn't necessarily love it because I was comparing it to Bloodborne the entire time, and Bloodborne is just so much better in my opinion. Up to that point, I'd been avoiding Dark Souls 2 because of all the negative things I'd heard about it. I had bought into all the common complaints. Things like bad hitboxes, ADP being a ridiculous stat, bosses being too easy, etc. But after defeating Dark Souls 3 and having no desire to complete its platinum, I figured it was time to try Dark Souls 2. After all, I don't feel like I should move on to Elden Ring just yet. To me, it's important to complete the Dark Souls trilogy before moving on to Elden Ring. In the beginning, you watch a badass cinematic which attempts to explain the journey you're about to embark on. For me, it went in one ear and out the other, but it was impressive in its presentation, and I felt as though I was watching a movie. The high quality of the cinematic got me fairly hyped for the experience that was to come, despite all the things that I believed about the game prior to playing. After the cinematic, you spawn into a place called Things Betwixt. Its name would indicate that you are in between worlds, as it literally translates to things between. It's a strange place to say the least, but is clearly designed as a tutorial to familiarize the player with basic gameplay mechanics. There's little more than the tutorial here, but it is worth noting two things. Number one, the first area that you spawn into is a farming ground for sunlight metals, which you will need to level in the Heirs of the Sun Covenant, which is required for the Platinum Trophy. I ended up spending something like 10 hours farming sunlight metals here. And even though it was mind-numbing and you do have an alternative location that you can farm sunlight metals, that alternative location is much more complicated. So it's worth noting that when you're ready to farm for sunlight metals, just come back to Things Betwixt. And number two, Things Betwixt is where you can trade with Dina and Tillo, the trading crows. Trading with Dina and Tillo is very similar to trading with Snuggly the Crow in Dark Souls 1. The primary difference between the two is that with Dina and Tillo, if you save all of your resources, things like prism stones, you can come back and trade as many times as you like. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, you drop a specific item, and you get a specific item back only once per playthrough. After Things Betwixt, you move on to the hub of the world called Majula. Majula is easily the most visually attractive hub in the Dark Souls trilogy. There's a lot to see, and it's designed almost like a small village of only a few houses, a huge hole in the ground that leads to terrifying lands, a talking cat, and a ton of NPC merchants that show up as you work your way through the game. And, visions of woman.
I love you.
Aside from purchasing items from the NPC merchants, there are other important things that happen in Majula, such as leveling up with the help of the Firekeeper, using the blacksmith to level weaponry, strengthen your Estus flask, traverse the hole, use a special 12k ladder to collect the Great Lightning Spear Miracle, which you need for the Platinum, wink wink, look super badass, and test out your weapon movesets. Side note, Majula immediately connects you to 3 different paths that you can take to progress in the game. From here, I'll explain them in the order that I experienced them in my first playthrough to stay as true to my initial experience as possible. The Forest of Fallen Giants is the first land connected to Majula that I weaseled my way into. The initial part of this land truly is a forest, which houses several hollows, a big hippo-looking motherfucker, and my first encounter with a lava lizard. You work your way into the ruins of an old castle where it's later understood that a battle took place between King Vendrick and the Golems against the Giants, which the Giants lost, hence the wording in the name of the location, Fallen Giants. Of note, this is where you will later find the memories of fallen giants that you will need in order to fight King Vendrick much later in the game. Forest of Fallen Giants is where I was first introduced to a new mechanic called Doors of Pharos. You can use special items called Pharos Lockstones to unlock these hidden doors, which hold a variety of possible important items behind them. In the Forest of Fallen Giants, you will find 2 bosses. The last giant, who I suppose is the final surviving giant from the battles against King Vendrick. He's quite easy, as most bosses are. You simply avoid getting stepped on and punished by slashing at his ankles with every opportunity that presents itself. The last giant is a proper introduction to the ease of difficulty associated with the majority of bosses throughout Dark Souls 2. The second boss you find in the Forest of Fallen Giants is the Pursuer. This guy was pretty tough for me at first. The Pursuer is one of those bosses that actually requires attention to detail, knowledge of his moveset, and becoming a master at timing his slash and spinning attacks. The Pursuer is one of the only bosses in the game that demands respect, and defeating him opens up a path to the Hawk Nest, which, once approached, a hawk will grab you and take you to the next discoverable location called the Lost Bastille. We'll talk more about the Lost Bastille later on, as I did not complete my initial run through there until much later. The next place that I conquered was Hyde's Tower of Flame. Hyde's Tower of Flame was the first intimidating place I had encountered due to the massive and powerful enemies all over the place. That, in addition to the fact that this place was clearly of higher stature than the forest I had previously worked through. Visually, it looks like Hyde's Tower of Flame was home to prestigious figures in the world of Dark Souls 2, which I would soon find to be true. Side note, Hyde's Tower of Flame is clearly Anor Londo if you take a second to observe the drowning architecture in the distance. If you never played Dark Souls 1, Anor Londo is the most popular, well-known location in the game, and is one of the first things that people think about when they think about Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls in general. By my third playthrough, I had realized how easy it would be to get through Hyde's Tower of Flame on a single life if I simply draw the enemies out one by one with arrows, so that's exactly what I did. This made otherwise complicated aggro mob combat very simple, and I was no longer intimidated or overpowered by the enemies here. This includes the massive dragon, which you can take out from a sniper spot with the Dragon Slayer bow and arrows. You can also use a regular bow and arrow, but I would highly recommend using arrows that are laced with some type of poison or something like that. If you happen not to have that in your inventory, then you can simply put on your best fire-resistant gear and bum rush the dragon because he's quite weak. Hyde's Tower of Flame is home to 2 bosses. Number 1, Dragon Rider. The fight against Dragon Rider is lacking in difficulty, especially if you pulled the lever earlier in the level, which helps you avoid the risk of falling into the water. Dragon Rider is weak enough that you can slash right through him pretty quickly with minimal dodging, and defeating him opens the path to the next location that I conquered, which was called No Man's Wharf. We'll talk about that in just a second. The second boss encounter at Hyde's Tower of Flame is the old Dragon Slayer. Even a blind man can see that this is actually Ornstein from Dark Souls 1. I sort of wish he was accompanied by Smo as well. I don't know the lore behind why only Ornstein is here in the cathedral, but this is a badass appearance anyway. His moveset is the same, but he seems a bit weaker than the original version you fight in Dark Souls 1. Aside from that, the fight is very cool, and you can acquire his armor set later in the game, which is also totally badass. Circling back to a location I mentioned just a second ago, No Man's Wharf is my personal favorite place in the entire game. It's unique and feels like you're fighting through waves of pirates. In fact, it reminds me of that scene from the Goonies where Mikey, Chunk, Sloth, and the gang discover One-Eyed Willie tucked away in a long-lost pirate ship which is hidden in an undiscovered cave. No Man's Wharf is dark and full of terrifying, unique enemies. You are clearly not welcome here, and everything is trying to cleanse their dark little cave of your filth. If you take your time in No Man's Wharf, you can clear the entire level with relative ease and ring a bell which brings a ship to dock. You fight a wave of tougher enemies on the ship in order to access No Man's Wharf's only boss, the Flexile Sentry. I found myself thinking that the name of this boss was very strange. I mean, what the fuck is a Flexile Sentry? So I googled it. It basically translates to a flexible soldier, which I guess is signified with its two torsos, meaning he can fight from either flank, stationed to keep guard or to control access to a place. Once you defeat the Flexile Sentry, you can steer the ship, via a cutscene, in the direction of the Lost Bastille. So I guess this means that the Flexile Sentry and the Pursuer from the Forest of Fallen Giants were the two lines of defense meant to protect against intruders to the Lost Bastille. Just an interesting tidbit. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't conquer the Lost Bastille until later on, so let's talk about my next victory, which took place in the Majula Hole. The Hole of Majula is home to a few different places which are home to a few different bosses. We'll talk about each of the locations as I experience them, as accessing them is fairly linear in the game. First up, you have the Grave of Saints. I have no idea who the saints are, but some landmarks that distinguish the Grave of Saints are the Dars of Pharos, half of which I never activated, a bunch of rat statues, and a big room full of coffins which also houses a handful of rat statues. I suppose I would know who the saints were if I took 2 seconds to look closer at the coffins, but I didn't. Anyway, the Grave of Saints is home to a single, very odd boss named the Royal Rat Vanguard. During the fight, you're mobbed by a bunch of normal-looking rats who are collectively the Royal Rat Vanguard. Definition time. According to Wikipedia, the definition of Vanguard is the foremost part of an advancing army. The single target which does damage to the health bar is the ugliest rat in the bunch. Once you find him and whack him up, you win the fight and move on. Getting past this fight helps you move on to the next area, the Gutter. The Gutter is a frustrating area on your first playthrough, if I'm being honest. I had to rely on very minimal lighting to work my way through it the first time. My traversal through this area was completely experimental, and eventually I made it all the way through. But on my later playthroughs, I took the time to light the torches, and this made it much easier to explore the area. The Gutter is possibly the most depraved location in the entire game, as it is simply a dark and hidden hole in between important areas of the game. It's full of terrifying blind creatures, hollows, and a gigantic bug that's too big for its own good. The Gutter is one of my favorite places in the game now, just for its visuals and creepy hidden nature. Once you work your way through the area, you will find a ladder which brings you downward to the final area of the Majula Hole, the Black Gulch. The Black Gulch is one of the most irritating places in the entire game. It may have been fine if there were less projectiles being shot at you, but that's contrary to FromSoft's intent. This area was meant to irritate you, and that's painfully obvious. Of note, you can gather a Soul of Lost Giants here, which is needed for defeating King Vendrick, as well as you can find the NPC Dark Diver Grandal, who you will need to visit later on to access the Dark Lurker boss fight. At the end of Black Gulch, you cross a fog wall and meet your first primal boss, the Rotten. The Rotten will drop the first of 4 great souls that you need to open a door in the Shaded Woods, which we'll talk about here shortly. According to most of the Dark Souls 2 community, the Rotten is not a tough boss fight. I thought differently because his hits do massive damage. Maybe I was fighting him too early in my first playthrough, but it took me a handful of tries before I eventually defeated him and lit the first primal bonfire. Lighting this primal bonfire returns you to Majula, signaling the end of that particular path in the base game. The next area I conquered is called the Shaded Woods. This area leads you down another path to a primal boss who we'll discuss in a few minutes. The Shaded Woods is an interesting transitional location that also gatekeeps the path to a late game area called Drang Langley Castle. At this point, we're not ready to go there, so we travel through the Shaded Woods onward to the Shaded Ruins. On our way there, we fight a bunch of pregnant uglies, take out a handful of invisible enemies called Shades, and talk to a severed head named Vengarl.
Leave me be. I like it quiet.
Vengarl tells us about his body,
Gay!
which still fights on independent from his living head. Side note, one of the more interesting items in the game is a shade corpse that you can wear on your back to prevent backstabbings. I decided to wear it in the Shaded Woods because I would occasionally get backstabbed by the invisible shades. I found it highly effective, but not a great fashion choice. Anyhow, after you escape the Shaded Woods, you find the Shaded Ruins. The Shaded Ruins are clearly ruins of a place which was previously inhabited by minimal life anyway. It looks to me to be a rural residential area. I'm nearly certain there's more to it, but the aesthetic doesn't tell you much. The most notable findings in the Shaded Ruins are a scorpion dude who hates his wife, Vengarl's hostile body, Dark Diver Grandal's primary residence, a bunch of tough lion dudes, and an important weaponsmith named Ornifex who I managed not to get any footage of, but here's someone else's footage. In the Shaded Ruins you find one boss, Scorpioness Najka, who is the scorpion dude's wife. Najka is basically the Dark Souls 2 version of Quelaag from Dark Souls 1. Quelaag is a spider that deals in fire and lava damage, whereas Najka is a scorpion who primarily deals physical and magic damage types. She's respectably difficult in her own right, but definitely not as tough as Quelaag was in Dark Souls 1. Apparently she's a grade A bitch, though, because remember, the scorpion dude was happy that we got rid of her. Taking out Najka grants access to the next area, the Doors of Pharos. This is an interesting location, serving as a land between more significant lands. It's basically an opportunity to explore and find some nice items for weapon upgrades, all sitting behind Doors of Pharos, which require utilizing the ever-so-finite Pharos lockstones. I would recommend researching which doors to open here before you use your lockstones so that you don't do silly things like activating traps. Other than some fairly insignificant combat and exploration, there is an optional boss here called the Royal Rat Authority. He's a big f***ing rat. If you're not careful, the little rats in the pond can cause you to die from poison damage while you're trying to fight the big f***er. But if you clean them up first, then you can fairly easily fight the big guy. He's quite easy once you learn the limited moveset, and it's an easy enough boss fight that you can leverage bonfire ascetics to fight the stronger versions of this boss to farm souls quickly. At the end of a long hallway of little stairs, you make your way onto the next area. Brightstone Cove Seldora is a sort of frustrating area, which is also strangely designed. Firstly, you'll notice a lot of falconers at the initial part of the area nearest the bonfire. They're tougher than those found in Things Betwixt, so they're not a viable option for farming sunlight metals. I would know, I tried for hours. If you walk down the hill from the bonfire, you begin to progress towards the next boss fight. You have to take out a handful of hollows and some spiders before you end up at the doors of a chapel. Inside of the chapel, you'll find your next boss fight against the Prowling Magus and the Congregation. According to the Oxford Dictionary, a Magus is a member of a priestly caste and a sorcerer or magician. The Congregation in this scenario, I suppose, would be the ugly creatures accompanying the Magus in the chapel. After a bit of Sunday service, you make your way past the chapel down to the abandoned dwellings below. If you explore a bit, there are some things to be found, including a southern ritual band, a few dark spirit invaders, a secret exploding chest,
That'll leave a nice scar.
a fuck ton of spiders, and finally, the primal boss, the Duke's dear Freya. The fight against Duke's Dear Freya is actually pretty tough because she's only vulnerable when you attack one of her 2 heads. Fighting her solo is difficult because she will be relentless in her attacks and you can't flank her. Fighting her with helpers can be difficult because it takes much longer to deal damage to her and you're constantly having to change which head you're attacking as she shifts focus back and forth between the player and the summoned NPC helpers. Defeating the Duke's Dear Freya means lighting our second primal bonfire. At this point in the game, I didn't know where to go, but then suddenly realized I hadn't yet traveled around the Lost Bastille. So that's where I went next. The Lost Bastille houses a ton of hollows, a blacksmith, a handful of pursuer clones, and some big sorcerer dudes. With some patient and dedicated exploration, you will make your way to the only boss fight in this part of the Lost Bastille, the Ruined Sentinels. The Ruined Sentinels boss fight is a frustrating one to say the least. I tried it every way possible. Melee only, melee and magic, with a helper, without a helper. The most success that I had was in one attempt I ended up fighting each sentinel on the platform that you originally dropped down onto when you first find the boss fight. Fighting them there provided me the opportunity to fight them one-on-one instead of 2 or 3 of them at the same time. Fighting them all at once was very stressful and complicated, but I overcame that scenario as well, albeit with a lot more difficulty. I'd consider this fight to be one of the hardest in the game. Individually, the sentinels are manageable, but 2 or 3 of them at one time quickly becomes a headache. After defeating the Ruined Sentinels, you move on to the next location, which is named differently, but basically looks exactly the same, Belfry Luna. This location can easily be considered an extension of the Lost Bastille, as there's very little difference between the two. The only notable thing about it is that this is where you first find the Bellkeeper's Covenant, fight a bunch of dwarf Bellkeepers, and ring the bell. This seems to be a callback to Dark Souls 1, because after you ring the bell, you make your way to a boss fight against the Belfry Gargoyles. I'm not sure this is the most difficult boss in the game, but it is definitely the most stressful. In Dark Souls 1, you fight 2 gargoyles, but in Dark Souls 2, you have to fight 6 of them. And as the fight continues, more of them wake up while you're actively fighting 1 or 2 already. If you manage to get through this fight alone, you're a beast. Defeating the Belfry Gargoyles leads you to a shortcut to the next area, Sinner's Rise. Like Belfry Luna, you can easily consider Sinner's Rise to be an extension of Lost Bastille, but there is a key difference. The majority of Sinner's Rise is actually beneath Lost Bastille and is the final area where you find a primal boss. Before the elevator, there are some hollow enemies which can take you out if you're not careful. Then, after taking the elevator down, you have to fight your way through a flooded area full of strong enemies, including another Flexile Sentry, which is even stronger than the original one that you fought in the form of a boss in No Man's Wharf. I had to summon a helper to get past him every time I went through Sinner's Rise. After you eventually get through that nightmare, you make your way to the entrance of your next boss fight. But before opening the door, it is most wise to set fire to the oil in both doorways flanking the main door in order to be able to see in the fight against this upcoming boss. Else you'll have to fight him in the dark, which is not fun. After setting fire to the oil, you enter the boss room where you encounter the Lost Sinner. The Lost Sinner is an intimidating, powerful, and quick boss. Given he's a primal boss, I'd say the difficulty is to be expected. If you go in with helpers, it's not difficult to down him on the first try. But in later playthroughs, it gets more complicated as there will be sorcerers accompanying him, attacking you at a distance. I would consider this fight one of the harder fights in the base game, as was the case with the other primals that came before him. In fact, the Lost Sinner is my least favorite primal boss to deal with in the game. Defeating the Lost Sinner gives us 3 of our 4 required Great Souls, and lighting the primal bonfire sends us back to Majula to see our fair lady yet again. Side note, at this point in the game, I didn't know where to go, so I ended up Googling it, and I learned that an NPC from Hyde's Tower of Flame named Licia of Lindelt had traveled back to Majula and is waiting for you to ask her to rotate a mechanism, which reveals a doorway to our next area, Huntsman's Copse. Huntsman's Copse is another strange but interesting area that feels out of place in the world of Dark Souls 2. It acts as a transitional place between worlds and is full of unique enemies just as the other areas are, but feels uniquely eerie. I found myself wondering what the name means, and so I looked it up. A huntsman is someone who hunts, obviously, and a copse is defined as a small group of trees. There's an area just before the undead purgatory in which there are several hostiles hiding in the trees or on structures above a path that the player walks through in order to reach a bridge. When the player walks through there, they jump down and attack. If you get past them and cross the bridge, you can enter a building named the Undead Purgatory, where you will find the Executioner's Chariot boss fight. The Executioner's Chariot is gimmicky and one of my least favorite fights. You have to run through a long tunnel, avoid getting run over by the chariot, avoid getting attacked by skeletons, pull a lever to break the chariot, and then attack the horse that remains. It's fairly straightforward and doesn't require learning movesets or strategy, just a bit of dodging on your way to the lever. On the other end of Huntsman's Copse, there are a bunch of tough enemies and a cave full of skeletons. Passing through this area will gain you access to the Skeleton Lord's boss fight, which is quite easy and features a variety of skeleton enemies. Not a ton to say about it, to be honest. The lords themselves are quick and easy to get rid of. The majority of the challenge comes when you have to take out the mob of skeletons that remain, the most annoying of which are the return of the bone wheels from Dark Souls 1. Even so, they are less of a threat in Dark Souls 2 than they were in Dark Souls 1. With a bit of finesse, you can avoid most attacks, swipe at the mob a few times, rinse and repeat. The fight is over quickly and easily, and then you move on to the next area from here. Harvest Valley. Harvest Valley is basically a land between important worlds yet again. It may be the most brief, and it introduces you to a few unique enemy types such as boobed witches and piggybackers. Oh yeah, and this happened.
Gay!
For some reason, this is also where you turn in sunlight medals for the Heir of Sun Covenant. I really have no clue as to why that is. Anyway, once you get through this brief area, you are on to the next. Earthen Peak is another location that sort of feels out of place and as if it doesn't quite serve as a cornerstone to the story, but there are a few interesting bosses, some down-dressed interesting finds, a unique mechanic to clear the building of its poison, and an interaction with the Laddersmith NPC who you will later find in Majula. Earthen Peak is also home to two bosses, Covetous Demon and Mytha the Baneful Queen. The Covetous Demon is probably the easiest boss in the game and barely requires an IQ above 30. But he is one of my favorites because of his design. He is basically the Dark Souls version of Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars. Given the fact he's basically just a huge disgusting blob, he has a very limited moveset and he poses very little threat to the player. He's also quite weak and it doesn't take long at all to get rid of him. Mytha, the Baneful Queen, is a stressful boss fight if you haven't cleared the poison first. If you have cleared the poison, she still poses a decent risk as she's quite shifty and can attack up close or at a distance. I'd consider her design one of the more unique and interesting designs for a boss throughout the game. Defeating Mytha gains you access to an elevator that takes you to the next area, everybody's favorite, Iron Keep. First of all, let me just interject to state that the elevator transition from Earthen Peak to Iron Keep is not that big of a deal. Anybody who complains about the continuity of the world design is just being nitpicky for the sake of maintaining their fake hatred of the game. The experience of going up the elevator does not ruin the entirety of Dark Souls 2, despite what you may have heard on other Dark Souls 2 video essays. Iron Keep tends to be the most frustrating level in the game for the majority of players, considering the ease with which you can trigger various mobs. Iron Keep forces you to take on the mob at times, but players who pay attention and use the environment to their advantage will find the challenge rewarding as they overcome enemies that run up on them while others are shooting Dragon Slayer arrows from a distance. After the initial part of Iron Keep, mob attacks are less significant and enemies are generally more manageable. There is a somewhat separate section of Iron Keep called Belfry Soul, in which you can join the Bellkeeper's Covenant and fight off several Bellkeepers as well as other invader types on the rooftop. Fighting your way through Belfry Soul gives you access to an alternative path around the second area of Iron Keep, but it's certainly not a shortcut. Side note, Belfry Soul is an important place due to a Covenant item which requires you to kill 30 invaders in order to level to rank 3 of the Bellkeeper's Covenant. That bit of farming is easily the worst I encountered in my journey to Platinum Dark Souls 2. At the end of Iron Keep, you'll find the final primal boss, the Old Iron King. The fight opens with an awesome cutscene that makes the boss look tougher than he really is. He does hit hard, but all it takes is a well-timed roll to avoid the hit, and then you can punish his arm while it sits on the ground for like 10 seconds. You do this a few consecutive times, avoiding getting thrown into the lava, and eventually you'll be met with victory. The Old Iron King was my final primal boss, so when I lit the bonfire at the end, I was officially met by Aldia for the first time after an explosion that I didn't see coming. As with the others, lighting the primal bonfire takes you back to Majula. After lighting all 4 primal bonfires and acquiring all 4 great souls, it's time to head back to the Shaded Woods and open the Shrine of Winter, which was previously unopenable. Apparently, I forgot to save a clip of my opening the Shrine of Winter, so here's a clip from Jeff the Big Lizard, showing the opening of the Shrine of Winter. After opening the Shrine of Winter, you move onward to one of the major locations of the game, Drangleic Castle. Drangleic Castle is not quite as iconic as Anor Londo from Dark Souls 1, but it is unique and serves a purpose of its own. The enemies here are quite tough, and you can unwittingly put yourself in some tough situations. Drangleic Castle is full of surprises and lots of intense combat. Perhaps the only real complaint that I have is the lackluster color palette. Side note, this is also where I officially completed my Platinum run in NG+++ by purchasing my final missing miracle from the Invisible Ghost Merchant. The entrance is an introduction to what's to come inside of the castle. The door doesn't open unless you feed the 2 golems at the door souls from downed enemies. This requires you to kill the enemies near enough to the golems that the souls will fly towards the golems. Once they're fed, they come to life and turn the 2 levers, which then open the giant door. Inside of the castle, you will find statues that come to life when you get too close, other types of traps, more doors that won't open unless you activate golems first, a hidden bonfire behind an illusory wall, and, of course, a few invaders. Once you've progressed far enough, you'll get a look at what Queen Nishandra used to look like. Don't be fooled, she's pretty ugly nowadays. Around the corner from Nishandra, you have to fight her 2 defenders, the twin dragon riders, one of which runs up on you like a madman and has a decent amount of health. The other dragon rider sits back and fires arrows at you. If you can manage to avoid the projectiles long enough, the second dragon rider will come down from his perch and you can deal a lot of damage to him very quickly. Like many of the others, this is not a hard boss fight, but did catch me slipping a few times. Afterwards, I found a strange room with a lady locked away in a cage. Interestingly, the key appears to be a living being with a keyhole for a face. This is one of the least settling visuals in the game for me. We don't have a key, but we do come back later with the key and put this guy out of his misery. And then the lady just evaporates. I still don't get it. In said room, you collect a key to the King's Passage. You then use this key near the elevator to enter the King's Passage. The entrance to King's Passage yields a surprise as well, as several of the statues leading to a fog wall come to life and try to do you in. If you persevere and cross the fog wall, it's time to fight possibly the coolest boss in the game, the Looking Glass Knight. If you've played Dark Souls 3, this guy and his arena somewhat resemble Dragon Slayer armor from Lothric Castle, which is pretty neat. The Looking Glass Knight is one of the tougher bosses in the game, has the most threatening aura out of all of the bosses in my opinion, and introduces an interesting mechanic, spawning additional enemies into the arena to help him defeat you. These additional enemies spawn into the arena via the Looking Glass Knight's shield, which is a large mirror. This same type of mirror can be found later on as well in Aldia's Keep. After toppling the Looking Glass Knight, you move onward to one of the most notorious places in all of the Dark Souls trilogy, the Shrine of Amana. The Shrine of Amana is a very punishing area if you attempt to proceed too quickly. Luckily for me, I took my time on my first playthrough and didn't struggle too much, but I can certainly see where other players would have trouble here. To simplify the explanation for what makes it difficult, I've compiled a list. Hidden enemies in the water, tough enemies above water that attack with melee, magic-wielding enemies who attack you at a distance while you're already engaged in combat against the tougher melee-centric enemies, walking through the water slows your movement, and finally, invisible underwater drop-offs that you can easily fall off of while engaged in combat. Side note, there are also some MILFs.
We knew you were coming.
They sing as they always have and always will. They know nothing of the world outside of the shrine, and according to them, don't need to. It's because of them that you can hear a constant singing voice all around the Shrine of Amana. As is the case in other mob-triggering areas in the game, it might benefit you to take weaker enemies out from a distance to avoid getting overpowered when you engage in close-quarters combat against mobs. Taking it as slow as possible and fighting as few enemies as you can at a time is a decent strategy for moving forward. It's also worth noting that, like in all other areas of the game, FromSoft does not ease the difficulty and throws several invaders at you in addition to the madness you're already enduring. If you manage to work your way through the treacherous Shrine of Amana, you get to fight my favorite boss in the game, the Demon of Song. The Demon of Song is another boss that is excruciatingly easy and can only take a few hits before dying. However, I think the Demon of Song is the coolest looking boss in the game. More than any other, this particular boss design reminds me of practical effects from the 1980s horror movies. I absolutely love 80s horror because of the practical effects, and I could see this boss being the inspiration for a monster in that type of film. The moveset is not impressive, nor does he do enough damage to be intimidating. He's slow and extremely predictable, but all things considered, still my personal favorite overall design. After defeating the Demon of Song, you take another elevator down to the next level, the Undead Crypt. After a brief visit from Aldia,
Venric, the near true monarch, is here, and not far off.
you get to proceed into the Undead Crypt, which I consider to be the darkest, most dead place in the game. By its name, you would probably be able to guess what kind of enemies you find here, but just to spell it out, you'll be fighting undead, skeletons, necromancers, and ghosts that, for whatever reason, only stick out about halfway from the wall. Side note, this was annoying. After working your way through the crypt and opening a giant door, you can access the big room I briefly mentioned earlier, which leads to a major badass boss fight against Velstadt. You'll have to go through him if you want the king. Velstadt is a total badass and one of the tougher bosses in the whole game. I consider him to be on the level of the Looking Glass Knight, just without the super cool stormy arena. His full name is Velstadt the Royal Aegis. A quick Google reveals that an Aegis is the protection, backing, or support of a particular person or organization. This is how we know that his job is to protect King Vendrick against your goal to put him down. The fight against Velstadt can be pretty intense, and he summons dark magic to be used against you in battle. It's worth noting that his hammer is topped with a bell that resembles the bells so well known in Dark Souls lore. After an intense battle against Velstadt, the door to Vendrick is opened. Vendrick is a sad sight to say the least, walking around as though his life hangs on by a simple thread. He's kept alive only by his desire to serve his evil queen Nishandra. That I decided to try my hand on him a few times, and he absolutely rocked my shit. It's pretty obvious that you're not supposed to fight him just yet. From here, you grab the King's Ring, and then you gain the ability to open the King's Doors, which you likely ran into around the world during your playthrough. Important side note, there are 3 doors that the King's Ring gives you access to. However, the only important one for now is the one at the Fork Road in the Shaded Woods that goes to our next area, Aldia's Keep. Aldia's Keep is a fairly simple area, which is essentially a long hallway full of enemies when you boil it down to substance. For what it's worth, there are those interesting mirrors on the wall that trapped enemies break out of, just like what we were seeing in the Looking Glass Knight fight. An NPC merchant who I chose to attack every time I saw him, invaders that spawn in every time you light a torch, a giant cyclops that tries to keep you from going up a set of stairs in the main atrium, a giant dragon skeleton that comes to life and gives you Aldia's key, a bit of mimicry, and at the very end, you get to fight a giant dragon boss called the Guardian Dragon. Most of the fight against the Guardian Dragon is spent avoiding the dragon spitting fire, and when he lands on the ground, you get a chance to deal major damage to the legs. As long as you're wearing some decent fire-resistant armor, it should be fairly easily to survive the fire if you make a few mistakes in the process, even if doing so solo. It doesn't take too long to finish him off, and then you get to take a nifty elevator to the next area, Dragon Eyrie. A quick Google search reveals that an eyrie is a large nest of a bird of prey typically built high in a tree or on a cliff. Dragon Eyrie is fairly intimidating at first glance, as you can see dragons flying all around, and you have to traverse the area via various wooden bridges and or skip to the end via a nifty zipline. If you choose to travel around, you'll have to deal with invaders and at least one guardian dragon. I don't quite remember because I used the zipline to avoid all of that once I realized it was a viable option to skip the exploration. After taking the zipline, there's an interesting bridge that gives you severe anxiety when you cross it for the first time. As you walk across the bridge, your camera view becomes less stable and zooms in. It's almost as if the game is telling you to hurry across the bridge before one of the flying dragons attacks you. At the same time, you're not too sure if sprinting will cause the bridge to collapse. Luckily, neither of those things ever happened to me. Once you get across the bridge, you arrive at a new place called Dragon Shrine. When you first reach Dragon Shrine and light the first bonfire, you'll be visited by a miniature version of Aldia, which I thought was pretty cool. Dragon Shrine contains a lot more substance, in my opinion, than Dragon Eyrie, because it's essentially a small castle with hallways, rooms, findable items, tough enemies to fight along the way, etc. Throughout the shrine, there are strange but harmless humanoid enemies that watch your every move. They wear armor sets depicting a dragon, and at one point you walk up a massive set of stairs and have to face one of them mano a mano. I got an extremely eerie feeling proceeding through this area personally. It was as though the single enemy that you fight on the stairs is the champion whom you need to defeat in order to gain access to the dragon at the top of the stairs. Once you get to the dragon, he speaks to you in some strange dragon language that's it's totally unintelligible. You have to read the captions to know what the hell he's talking about. R.I.P. illiterates. At the end of the dialogue, he gives you the Ashen Mist Heart, which you will need for accessing the memories of giants back in the Forest of Fallen Giants from much earlier in the game. Side note, remember how I wasn't ready to fight Vendrick yet? It turns out that you need 4 or 5 souls of a giant in your inventory in order to weaken Vendrick. In our current state, we're not able to damage him enough to defeat him in any reasonable amount of time, so we'll need to collect the 5 souls of a giant before we go back to fight Vendrick. Surprise, the ancient dragon has one of them. Also surprise, he is a boss fight. After getting absolutely wrecked by the ancient dragon several times, I managed to defeat him and gain one of the souls of a giant that I needed if I wanted to eventually defeat Vendrick. Now that we have one soul of a giant, we need to go back to the Forest of Fallen Giants and visit each of the giants' memories. Side note, the giants' memories are flashbacks of the battles that took place between Vendrick's army and the fallen giants. In the memory of Oro, you collect a soul of a giant at the very end. In the memory of Vemar, you also collect a soul of a giant at the very end. And finally, in the memory of Jai, you must defeat the Giant Lord boss. Defeating the Giant Lord will grant you the 4th soul of a giant and Giant's Kinship, which is a key item needed for the final boss fight in the main game. For the 5th and final soul of a giant, you'll need to go back to Black Gulch for some fucking reason. In the Black Gulch, there's a hidden cave beneath, near where we found Dark Diver Grandal earlier. Within the cave, there are 2 living giants that you need to put down. Once done, you'll receive the final soul of a giant, and now you're ready to go back to the Undead Crypt and fight King Vendrick. Gathering the souls of giants does not weaken the power of Vendrick's attacks, so it's worth noting that he is still a powerhouse. However, his health bar takes significantly more damage now that we've collected the souls of giants. Reminder, they have to be in your inventory, do not consume them. This fight is sort of similar to the first fight we fought against the last giant. You just dodge a few slow attacks, stay by the feet, and punish when the opportunity is presented. If you have all giant souls, this one will be over pretty quickly. After defeating Vendrick, you can go into his memory and visit the prime healthy version of Vendrick before he was reduced to his current hollow form.
Seeker of fire, coveter of the throne. I am Vendrick, ruler of Drang Lake. As flame rises, so does it fade. Such is the way of things. Do you intend to link the fire? Then you must first take the throne. Prove your worth. Find the ancient crowns. Seek adversity, and they will be yours. And your wishes granted.
Side note, at this point we have the King's Ring from our first visit to King Vendrick. We also have the Giant's Kinship from defeating the Giant Lord in the memory of Jai, and in order to fight the final boss of the game, you will need both of those items. Now that we've spoken with Vendrick, it's time to go to the Throne of Want for our final battles. To get to the Throne of Want, you have to go back to Drangleic Castle, and there will be a door that can only be opened with the King's Ring equipped. Once past the door, you can speak with the Firekeeper one final time.
My journey is already complete. My name is Shanalot. The dragon gave me this name, for I was born with none. I was born of dragons, contrived by men, by ones who would cozen fate herself. They are the ones who created me. But they failed. I did not come out as intended. Fate would not be bested, and men were cursed once again. If you proceed, Nashandra will come after you, knowing that you will take the throne and link the fire. She covets the first flame and the great soul. Put Nishandra to rest.
At the end of a long bridge, it's time to fight 2 battles. The first against the Throne Watcher and Defender. Theirs is a difficult fight because they both try to stay in your face the entire time. When you've managed to kill one, the other one will revive the one that you've just killed. It's only during that window where you have an opportunity to finish the second one. If you manage to do that before the other is revived, then you will win this fight. Otherwise, you'll have to fight them both again, one of which will be revived with a full health bar. The best strategy is to weaken them both down to the point that either of them can only withstand 1 or 2 more hits and then finish them both at the same time. When you've defeated them, then it's time to meet the real Nishandra, that pretty lady from earlier in the castle.
You have fought admirably on your journey, cursed undead. I am Nishandra, Queen of Dranglake. A true monarch carries the weight of their souls. The last king of this land, King Vendrick, as he was called. He found the strength to rule his people, and when the undead were born, cursed, he found more strength to face them. But in the end, he never took the true throne. We have no need for 2 rulers.
Depending on whether you held Giant's Kinship in your inventory when you first defeated Throne Watcher and Defender, you will see one of 2 possible cutscenes. One in which Nishandra enters the room immediately after defeating the Throne Watcher and Defender, and another in which you enter the room and she's already there waiting for you. In either case, the dialogue is the same, but this is an interesting difference.
Brave undead. You have proven yourself to me. Now, be one with the dark.
Anyway, Nishandra is no f***ing joke. Nishandra uses dark magic against you from the very beginning. The one tactic that I was able to use is to first focus my effort on destroying her dark magic pillars that surround her first. She will spawn them back in on occasion, so it's important to get rid of them quickly. After that, the process of fighting Nishandra is fairly standard. Watch for the telegraphed moves, dodge as you normally would, and punish when there are windows of opportunity. She doesn't take as much damage as the other bosses, so it takes a while, but eventually you will down the queen and the throne is all yours. Unfortunately, to Platinum Scholar of the First Sin, you have to collect several items throughout the DLC, defeat several bosses, yada yada yada. So we aren't quite done here. After the endgame cutscene, the game doesn't automatically go into the new game cycle. Instead, you can choose to go into the next cycle at the bonfire in Majula. This means that before we move into our next game cycle, we can continue onward into the DLC, which is precisely what I did. Throughout the base game, there are portals to access the DLC in 3 different areas. One after the Old Iron King Arena, another after the Rotten Arena, and the third such portal is in the Shrine of Winter.
You who link the fire. You who bear the curse. Once the fire is linked, souls will flourish anew, and all of this will play out again. It is your choice to embrace or renounce this. Great Sovereign, take your throne. What lies ahead, only you can see.
First, I went to Broom Tower. Guys, I apologize in advance. I honestly don't want to go in depth about the DLC, so I'm going to distill this down into a few specific points. Number 1, the enemies that you face in the DLC are way tougher. The mobs are larger, and the bosses are harder too. I've come to expect this from FromSoft DLC content. Broom Tower is reportedly the toughest of the 3 DLCs in Dark Souls 2, but in my experience, all 3 were about the same level of difficulty. Just happens to be the case that Broom Tower takes a lot longer to get through. Number 2, one of the requirements for the Platinum is to trade the full soul of Nadalia for a pyromancy named Outcry. You can acquire this from Strayed near Sinner's Rise. But in order to get Nadalia's soul, you have to collect all 12 fragments of Nadalia's soul, which are littered throughout Broom Tower. To get the fragments, you need to use smelter wedges and destroy the ashen idols of Nadalia. So, you have to collect 11 smelter wedges, destroy 11 ashen idols, and then, to complete Nadalia's soul, you have to gather the final fragment of Nadalia's soul after defeating one of the toughest bosses in the DLC, Sir Alone. The difficulty to overcome this challenge is extreme without planning or intent. I didn't plan anything when I went to Broom Tower, but I did intend to complete the Platinum, so I collected every possible item and kept it in my inventory throughout my playthrough of the DLC. When I had to go back and finish my collection of Nadalia's soul fragments, most of the work was already done, which made it a lot easier for me. I wouldn't blame anybody for giving up on the Platinum over this particular challenge. And number 3, you are not required to defeat all bosses in the DLC. I chose to defeat several, but not all. We'll talk about that more later on. As for my experience in Broom Tower, it felt like a massive puzzle. The enemies whooped my ass many times, and the boss runs all required despawning in Broom Tower. The first boss I fought in the Broom Tower DLC was the Blue Smelter Demon, which reminds me, I didn't speak on the original Smelter Demon from Iron Keep. He was tough as hell, and I needed to despawn Iron Keep in order to fight him with all my health intact. I also fought him with a helper, and I think he's the only boss that I may not have been able to handle by myself. Maybe I just don't believe hard enough. As I mentioned previously, I had to despawn the boss run to Blue Smelter Demon, and the boss was hard as fuck too. As was the case with the original Smelter Demon, I needed helpers, and it probably took me 20 tries or so before I eventually achieved victory. The second boss I fought in Broom Tower was the Fume Knight. The Fume Knight took at least 25 or 30 attempts for me, and I struggled to master the moveset. However, the Fume Knight is one of the cooler bosses in the game. His flaming sword is totally badass, but I'd be lying if I told you this was one of my favorite fights. The moveset requires you to adapt to some odd timing. Fume Knight telegraphs a few of his moves early and then pauses. So if you want to successfully dodge the attack, then you need to delay your reaction as well, which was a major pain point for me. But eventually I overcame the challenge. Defeating the Fume Knight gives you the crown of the Old Iron King, which then allows you to access Sir Alone's memory at the top of Broom Tower. So the third boss that I fought in Broom Tower was technically Sir Alone. The memory itself is a brief run back to the boss, but probably the second hardest, only behind the run back to Blue Smelter Demon. I knew I would need all of my Estus, so I set out to despawn Sir Alone's memory from the outset, and it took me 2 days. After that, I was able to fight him over and over until I eventually overcame him, just like the others. Sir Alone is about as hard as any boss in the game, but I found it easier to learn his moveset than it was to learn the moveset of the Fume Knight for some reason. However, he was faster, so I struggled more. I have no idea how many attempts it took before I beat him, but I found it invaluable to fight him solo to avoid the reduction in damage that occurs when you fight a boss with a summon. I imagine the fight with Sir Alone is similar to that which I will see when I eventually play Sekiro, but I have no idea. I've never played Sekiro before, but what I can tell you is that Sir Alone's fighting style is heavily influenced by Japanese history and culture, specifically that of the samurai. His primary weapon is a katana, and he wields it in a traditional stance. Defeating Sir Alone earns you the final fragment of Nadalia's soul, which you can then trade in for the Outcry Pyromancy from Strait of Alaphus back in the Lost Bastille, or Sinner's Rise, whatever you consider that area to be. Next up, I went to Shulva, the Sanctum City. I don't quite remember what was required for the platinum here, but I spent a significant amount of time exploring and fighting through the Sanctum City. Again, the enemies were very tough here, and an additional unique challenge was posed here as well. One of the needs to advance to a later part of the city is to use platforms that are activated with arrows from a distance. Lifting the correct platforms in the correct sequence was a challenge, but eventually I got it. You work your way into what looks like a pyramid and fight against a plethora of even more complicated enemies, while also dealing with things like spikes on the ground that damage you while you run through them. I did make my way to one of the boss fights, but I couldn't stand it, and I eventually gave up when I realized that I didn't need it for the platinum. I am not a big fan of Shulva Sanctum City. Onward to the third and final DLC, Frozen Alium Lois. Again, more difficult enemies, but in the snow this time. I found Frozen Ilium Lois to be slightly more enjoyable in its exploration than Shulva Sanctum City, but at this point I was more interested in the base game, and I felt I was wasting time in the DLC. I did explore for a while, and I have no idea what was required for the platinum here, but I didn't stick around for the entire thing, just like the Sanctum City. In fact, the only boss that I fought in Frozen Ilium Lois was the invisible tiger named Ava, the king's pet. After defeating Ava, I confirmed I didn't need anything more of the DLC, and I went back to the base game to chase down the final boss that I needed for the Platinum Trophy, Dark Lurker. In order to fight Dark Lurker, you need a few things. Number 1, find Dark Diver Grandal in 3 different locations: Black Gulch, Shaded Ruins, and Drangleic Castle.
I am Dark Diver Grandal, seeker of dark, giver of dark.
At each location, he sits next to a portal that requires you to trade 1 humanity to activate the portal. Once the portal is activated, you can enter the portal, fight your way through the chasm, and then once you've completed the chasm, you move on to the next one. There are a total of 3 chasms, 1 at each location, and after clearing the 3rd chasm, you are finally able to fight the Dark Lurker. Dark Lurker is a tough boss, one of the tougher ones in the base game, but she does not compare to the bosses in the DLC. She poses a threat from a distance as she uses various forms of magic and pyromancies. She flies and also spawns a clone, which makes things a little bit more complicated for the player. The strategy that I decided to use was to equip and use the Great Fireball Pyromancy to weaken her first and then dodge as many attacks as possible. Once I saw opportunities, I would go in for the kill. With a lot of patience, I was able to pull it off and she was done for. Finally, I had defeated all base game bosses. Aside from everything we've already talked about, there were several items that I had to collect in order to get the platinum. Things like pyromancies, miracles, hexes, etc. Some of these items required farming to level up in covenants in order to earn covenant items. The 2 worst bits of farming required were sunlight metals, which I did in Things Betwixt, and the invaders in Belfry Soul. After all of those things were collected, it was game over, and I officially became a holder of the Dark Souls 2 Platinum Trophy. Thank you so much for watching. Leave me a thumbs up and subscribe if this video didn't totally suck dick. And I'll see you next time with my Platinum experience on Dark Souls 3, which was way worse. Again, thanks so much, and take care, you bums.